Welcome to everybody, especially the students who are here. Anzi, fatemi dire due parole in italiano prima di passare all'inglese. Quindi di nuovo benvenuto a tutte e a tutti, gli studenti innanzitutto e poi tutto il pubblico un pochettino più attempato. E siamo molto contenti di essere qui per la nostra 22esima lezione Vilfredo Pareto. La lezione Vilfredo Pareto, la prima fu fatta, le prime due furono fatte nel 2007, abbiamo cominciato nel 2007 e cerchiamo di tenerle più o meno una all'anno. In realtà avevamo saltato il 25, però ci stiamo ampiamente rifacendo quest'anno perché c'è la lezione del professor Snyder e poi in occasione del Festival Internazionale di Economia ci sarà una seconda Pareto, quindi ripigliamo il tempo perduto e per cui tra l'altro Pareto Lecture, che è appunto una tradizione molto distinguished, possiamo anche dire di essere purtroppo Jim, nonostante il fatto che abbia da giovane studiato anche economia, poi ha deciso di diventare un political scientist ovviamente con risultati molto brillanti, non è più un economista perché siamo riusciti a prenominare 6 premi Nobel con la nostra Pareto Lecture, quindi diciamo che è un ottimo segnale. I think you got the joke, I think I already told you. Quindi in ogni caso benvenuti a tutti. Devo anche osservare che per l'appunto sempre collegato al Festival Internazionale di Economia questo è un evento di avvicinamento al festival, quindi fa parte diciamo della serie di festival continuo che noi cerchiamo di portare avanti con la città, quindi al di là del festival ufficiale che sarà dal 22 al 25 di ottobre quest'anno, però ci sono varie iniziative di cui questa è una, ce ne sono altre, sono già state e ce ne saranno. Quindi a nome del Collegio Carlo Alberto, a nome del Presidente che in realtà è qui davanti a me, però ha deciso di far fare gli onori di casa a me, vi do il benvenuto e lascio la parola a Francesco Passarelli, mio collega Francesco Passarelli, che darà una presentazione più scientifica di Jim Snyder e direi forse a questo punto passiamo all'inglese.
Sì, certo. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Paolo, and thanks to Professor Snyder. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Snyder today, one of the most influential scholars in the study of democratic institutions. Professor Snyder serves as a Leroy Williams Professor of History and Political Science at Harvard University. Over the course of his career, he has also had appointments at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the University of Chicago, what I would consider, arguably, the 3 academic institutions that have most contributed to the shaping of the field of political economy worldwide. Professor Snyder is also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Science. What makes Professor Snyder's scholarship particularly distinctive is the way it combines deep institutional understanding, formal theory, and rigorous empirical analysis in order to address foundational questions about how democratic systems work. His studies address important issues and answer relevant questions which are crucial to the understanding of how politics works and how it affects the life of citizens. These are difficult questions in general, with no obvious answers. This is why Snyder's contributions are valuable not only to the scientific community, but to society as a whole. Here are a few of these important questions his work has addressed. For instance, how do electoral systems shape candidates' incentives? Why certain political equilibrium, notably the persistence of a two-party systems in the US system, emerge and endure? How can we infer legislators' preferences from observed voting behavior? What are the motivations behind campaign contributions? How do institutional rules shape the flow of resources within the political systems? How do media influence the allocation of government's resources? Well, it is not easy to provide a concise overview of Professor Snyder's extensive scholarly output. Here, I will mention only a few of his many works, and I apologize to Jim and to you for not being eventually exhaustive. Let me just begin with a paper, The Value of the Vote. Professor Snyder and his co-author exploit institutional variation arising from redistricting and new electoral rules to estimate the causal impact of political institutions on voter behavior and electoral outcomes. This is, in my opinion, particularly important from a methodological point of view, but also it turns out to be important also, in this period, as I will mention, shortly. At a time in which much of the political science relied on descriptive correlation, Professor Snyder's approach marked a significant shift from correlation to causal inference. As a result, by the way, it demonstrates that even small institutional changes, like a small redistricting, can significantly alter electoral incentives. This is particularly relevant in this period in which we are expecting the midterms election in the United States, and redistricting is one of the issues that have been raised to assess which will be, the strategic moves of the ruling party to gain electoral consensus. In an informational rationale for political parties, another influential work, Professor Snyder explores the roles of political parties as informational tools that help voters make decisions under conditions of uncertainty. In another major strand of his research, he focuses on legislative behavior and institutional design. For instance, in estimating state dependence utility function, Professor Snyder develops econometric tools to infer legislators' preferences from observed voting behavior. A third domain in which Professor Snyder has made a foundational contribution is campaign financing and the political role of money. In a series of influential papers, he challenges the conventional wisdom that campaign contributions are primarily an investment to buy influence. His work suggests that political giving may be an expression of preferences, a kind of consumption good. In making this reframing, he changed the way we understand the influence and the participation in democratic systems. Closely related to this work is also the work on party finance, including the role of the so-called soft money. This work helps clarify how parties respond to incentives embedded in legal and institutional frameworks. And more recently, Professor Snyder has turned his attention to political economy of media and information, a really current topic. In Newspaper and Public Policy, another influential paper, he provides compelling evidence that media coverage affects the allocation of government's resources. It turns out that regions with greater access to newspapers tend to receive more public spending, suggesting that information plays a crucial role in enhancing political accountability. This is not simple correlation, that's crucial. This is causal evidence that showing that information flows influence policy outcomes. reinforcing the idea that media and institutions are critical components of democratic systems. Across all these areas, what stands out is not only the importance of Professor Snyder's findings, which are important per se, but also his methodological contribution. He has been at the forefront of the shift toward credible identification strategies, using techniques that have become a standard in the empirical practice. This transformation, also often referred to as the credibility revolution, has reshaped the discipline, and Professor Snyder's work has been central to that process. Professor Snyder's work has shaped the research agenda of subsequent generation of scholars. Across political science and economics, his work has helped define what we now consider best practices in empirical political analysis. And let me conclude with a personal note. We were delighted a few months ago to learn that Jim Snyder was interested in spending some months as a visiting scholar at the Collegio. Personally, I was sure that he would have significantly impacted the entire collection community. The courtesy and willingness with which Jim has engaged in Collegio life came as no surprise. They only met the high expectations we had ahead his arrival. For all these reasons, it is truly an honor for me to introduce Professor Snyder's Vilfredo Pareto lecture on nationalization and polarization of U.S. politics. Please join me in welcoming Professor Snyder today.
Okay, well, thank you for that very kind introduction, overly kind. Today, I'm gonna not do anything causal at all. This is all just gonna be descriptive, mostly data, some anecdotes, but mostly data regarding the importance of federalism in the US. So federalism is taken for granted, basically, by Americans as like how government runs. And even though there's probably lots of confusion among Americans about what level of government, is this better? Okay. What level of government, each government level of government does, and how it all fits together. There's a lot of confusion about this, even among scholars, but especially among the public. Is this better? Bad? It's good. Okay, good. I can't tell because I'm just not used to using a mic. Anyway, despite this confusion, there's a kind of like a sense that Americans know, broadly speaking, what levels of government are doing what, like not in details, but in terms of they know, for example, that the schools are run by the local governments, and the roads are fixed by the local governments, and the sewers and all the infrastructure. Basically, all infrastructure in the US is done by state and local governments. Almost nothing is done by the federal government outside a few things here and then some transfer money here and there. And Americans kind of know this. There's a sense in which, like the most provocative thing I could say, I'll just say it now, is that there's a sense in which Americans are so sure that the national government doesn't really matter that much for a lot of what goes on, that they can vote however they feel like at the national level. And it will not actually have a whole lot of effect on their day-to-day lives. So one could say that lots of people vote nationally in a very symbolic, expressive kind of way. And then when they go and vote locally, possibly at the state level, although probably not, but locally, they put on a different hat. That's not ideological, that's not partisan, that's pragmatic. And it's about like, okay, so who can run the schools better here? We should vote for them. So what I want to provide is evidence through this that I'm not going to provide great evidence for that last statement, that voters are pretty good at picking the people who are going to run the schools. But there's a lot of evidence in that direction. And I think we might say that at a minimum, they're pretty good at avoiding the worst types. And I'll show some evidence on that. The reason this topic is especially relevant now is that this idea has been percolating for a while, that local politics has become nationalized. State politics has become nationalized, and all voters just put on their partisan hat, go to the polls, or their ideology, and go to the polls and pull a bunch of levers all up and down, only on the basis of what is going on at the national level. National issues are now dominating everything. And so here are just like some quotes from newspapers, and that's what they say. And then academics have been also saying this. This is probably too small. Okay. Yeah, I guess these slides are going to be a little small. But anyway, academics have also been looking around and finding evidence for this same thing. There's recently two very important books, The Increasingly United States and Nationalized Politics, together with three of, you can find probably a dozen articles in highly important journals making this same point. Politics, the national level politics have been leaking down and taking over, in some sense, what used to be decisions made on the basis of local issues, local conditions, and so on and so forth. And now schools are all about DEI or banning books, wokeness, and so on. School politics as an example. What I want to argue is that that's not exactly all happened yet. It's moved a little bit in that direction, but in fact, it's not. This is exaggerated, at least as of 2020, and looking at some data from 2024, even 2024, this is exaggerated. It's not entirely wrong, but there's big parts that are wrong, that are wrong about this. This is the kind of data that the academics look at. They see polarization in Congress. This would be like, how differently do Republicans, Democrats vote from one another? And it's been going up and up and up. So Democrats vote one way, Republicans vote the other way. In Congress, in state legislatures, at the elite level, I think it's pretty well documented, these figures say it. At the elite level, the level of the elected politicians, at the state level and at the national level, a lot of nationalization and polarization has happened. The top figures show how people vote, and it's, again, those figures are going up and up. So over time, these are, I don't know if you can see, this is like 1995 to 2025, so this like 30-year period. And we see that at the elite level, the legislatures are becoming more and more polarized on average, and then voters are voting in a more and more partisan way. That is, if they have a party ID, like they call themselves a Democrat or they call themselves a Republican, they consistently vote that way almost all the time now when party labels are on the ballot. So those numbers for like House vote versus party ID, PID, party ID, so those figures on the right say that it used to be like that if you were a Democrat, you would vote the Democratic person for House 80% of the time, but you'd vote for the Republican 20% of the time. And now that number has changed and it's more like 5 and 95. So you vote 95% for your own party and 5% for the other party about. At the level of the US House, US Senate, and for president, it was already even higher. The question is, what about for a school board? Or what about in a nonpartisan election? Or what about for sheriff or lots of these other local offices and state offices what's going on. And we know much less because it's hard to get the data, basically. So I can do lots of describing, because we've collected a bunch of data that were not available before. Here's just a couple of, here's one important theoretical point, or not really, it's not theoretical. Here's one important methodological point. Lots of, some journalists, but more actually academics, have missed the distinction between measuring preferences at the local level, which we've gotten better and better and better at, and measuring preferences about local political things, which is a different thing. Local political things are your preferences over like how much money to spend on schools versus police versus the fire department versus other public goods, parks and recreation, so on and so forth. Preferences at the local level are, at the level of the city, how many Democrats are there here? How many Republicans? What's their ideology? How left-right are they? And so on and so forth. Those are not the same, and we want to make sure that we keep them separate. And what we want to know for the local level is really much more about this part here, which Sarah Anzia, who's a well-known scholar in this field, said, basically, yeah, the problem is we don't know very much. And that's one of the things that we can start to do with the data that I'll show you in just a sec, or that we'll get to in a sec. But before going there, I want to spend a few minutes, hopefully not too many, telling a group of mostly Italians and foreigners why, just a few facts about federalism in the US and about state and local governments in the US and why federalism is so important, because I think it's kind of not well understood. So here's Italy superimposed on the US. So you see the size difference. So federalism is crucial in the US because, well, we have 350 million people spread across an area, just huge. So there's no way the central government can just do everything. It would probably just not work, probably not. We've never tried it. We've always had a federal system, and we've always had very strong state governments. And in fact, in the past, the state governments and the local governments did even more in terms of like share of total government spending, for example, than they do now. But they're still hugely important. And to give you a sense of, I'll skip ahead and then go back. To give you just a sense of how important they are, here's like what governments, here's a graph, whatever, a chart, that says for each item here, kindergarten through 12 education, public safety, that is police, fire, courts, and so on and so forth, what levels of government spend the money? And also raise the money. And we see that, for example, for K through 12 education, 90% of the money is raised and spent by state or local governments. And the federal government does 10%. And so on. For police and courts and everything, it's 84% state and local, 16% federal, and so on. So with a couple of exceptions here, like housing which is mostly low-income housing, transfer stuff, with the exception of transfer things and national defense, almost everything else is done by state and local governments. And they're doing it with their own resources, not massive transfers. They do get some transfers, billions and billions of dollars in transfers, for sure. But most of it is coming from their own tax resources. So they're autonomous, and they make the decisions how they want, by and large, on almost all these policy areas. And in particular, on like infrastructure stuff, education spending, even higher education spending, highways and roads, so on and so forth. So they're autonomous, and so the national government might try and impose some policies on them, but they can only probably be moved a tiny bit. If they don't want to do something, they just won't do it. So this is the reason we care about what the state and local governments are doing, and who is doing it, and how they're chosen, and whether the citizens are doing a good or bad job of choosing the leaders and kicking out the bad ones, keeping the good ones, and so on and so forth. We need, in the US, we need state and local democracy to function well if we have democracy throughout, and including these smaller governments. They're not just administrative unions, they have to be separate governments because they just do too much. Let me go back for a sec. Let me go forward and then go back. So there's another thing that's very important about local governments, more than state governments. State governments have more or less the same exact structure as the national government in almost all cases. They have two chambers as a legislature. They have an elected separate governor. They have a quote, presidential system of government. And they, with one exception, one state that has a non-partisan one-chamber legislature, all the rest have two chambers, everything partisan, elected governor, elected other state officials, and a separate court system that's sometimes elected, sometimes appointed. Local governments, by and large, are not partisan. The biggest cities are partisan, and lots of county governments are partisan. But most elected officials in the US, there are 500,000 elected officials in the US, by the way, roughly, and so 500,000. And in, oops, oh, I'm going the wrong way here. Didn't want to go anywhere, oops, sorry. And as an example, in 2025, there were like 70,000 offices to be filled for that 1 year, in that 1 year, an odd year. A lot of local elections happen even off the presidential years, which are always, you know, every 4 years, divisible. And then the midterm years are held in the other years. And then lots of local elections are held on at those times as well, or in those years at other times. But very many local elections are even held completely at other times, odd years. And in part, it's to insulate them from what's going on at the national level. Probably, yeah, you know, held at a time with another, oh God, just by itself. So we have to pay for yet another election. Why would we bother to do that? Well, in the past, because they wanted to insulate these things. And we can see here that they're also like 90% of these elections were school board ones were nonpartisan. 80% of city council races were nonpartisan, similarly for mayors. And then for other kinds of officials, clerks, judges, there's lots and lots and lots of elected officials around in the US. Another thing that local governments do, which we're going to exploit, is they vote, the citizens vote directly on lots of policies. There's a lot of direct democracy at the local level and at the state level in a selected set of states. About half the states, there's lots of direct democracy even at the state level. At the local level in thousands of cities, there's a lot of local democracy. In that, the citizens have to vote for bonds to fix anything, for budget increases, for tax increases, even for lots of regulations that we don't understand why exactly they have to vote on these, but they have to vote on these because of state law and so on, or the form of government that locality has chosen. Anyway, so state and local governments involve a lot of democracy. So we want to know, is this democracy functioning pretty well or not? Now, there's good reasons to believe that it's not, because let me go back here 2 slides. So let's start here. Okay, before I go to that, there are good reasons to think that it might fail. That's the next slide. There are very good reasons to think that we would like this type of government to be not nationalized, not polarized politically, not hugely partisan. And that's basically, from this slide, you know, this one statement here. There's no Democratic or Republican way of cleaning the streets. So there's no Democratic or Republican, there's no ideological, there's not a huge amount of what the local governments and the state governments, probably more the local governments, are doing is not heavily ideological or partisan. We don't want it to become heavily ideological or partisan. Parts of it are always linked to some partisan things and ideological things, but big chunks of what they do, we want to keep insulated from that, if we can. And if we don't, here are some of the problems that can arise. Like, if voters are just sitting there saying, okay, I'm a Democrat, I vote for all the Democrats, or I'm a Republican, I vote for all the Republicans, I don't even look at their CVs, then how do I know I'm getting a good sheriff? You know, I mean, maybe I should look at the CV of the person or something, or something about their past record, or something about their personal campaign, why they're gonna, like, because do I think there's a Democratic way of running the jails or arresting people, or Republican? Not really. So for an office like sheriff, or an office like school board, or an office like maybe even county commissioner, much of what they do is not ideological, not partisan, and I don't want it to be. And if I'm focusing on partisan or ideological cues, then I might just elect the wrong kind of people in the first place. Then I'm not going to be holding them accountable as well, because I'm not going to be looking at how they performed on the tasks they're supposed to be performing and evaluating them and then re-electing them if they do a good job, and kicking them out if they do a bad job. I won't be doing that either, so we'll have worse accountability. We might get gridlock because we get all these partisan ideological fights that are going on, like in Congress. Maybe that will happen even at the local school boards meetings. Instead of like figuring out how to like improve the science program, they'll be spending hours and hours and hours figuring out which books to take out of the library or something like this, or how to impose more wokeness or avoid wokeness or whatever that is, and so on. And so they'll be wasting time on second order issues instead of from the point of view of what they're supposed to be doing. So for all these reasons, we would like maybe nonpartisan stuff. However, nonpartisan elections are very challenging. There's a long tradition in political science that basically documents, since the late 40s, but since the 50s and 60s especially, that voters are not very capable. They don't pay attention. They don't know what's going on. They have no idea what ideology is. And therefore, well, how do we rely on them? Well, okay, they at least have party ID and they can go for the party, and then whichever party maybe has a little more enthusiasm that year because they've been out of power or because they've got a really good candidate or something like that, they get a little more support from their partisans, and the party, and just voting party is good enough maybe to muddle through and have the democracy work. So there's this long thread which says, well, the only way to run elections anywhere that are large with thousands of people, maybe hundreds of thousands of people, is partisan elections. Voters aren't capable of doing the complicated, incredibly tedious, boring work of watching like a bunch of local government officials do stuff and then deciding who's a good one and a bad one, and then pick the good ones and kick the bad ones out. Not going to happen. So give up, make things partisan, and muddle through as best you can. One problem with that in the US for state and local governments is that what that will produce is just one-party bastions. Almost everywhere. Not every single person lives in a one-party bastion, but some version of 3/4 of the American public. Depends on where you draw cutoffs, where you cut things off. But where I live, Cambridge, Massachusetts, everybody's a Democrat. Or it's 90% Democratic, or at least 75% Democratic. And no Republican ever comes close to winning anything. It's just Democrats. So the only question is what type of Democrat? You get a developer Democrat, you get a lawyer Democrat, you get an academic Democrat, you get a working class Democrat, if there were any left in Cambridge. Anyway, same. You just get a Democrat. In fact, that's true of the whole state of Massachusetts. There's hardly any Republicans that win anything in Massachusetts. And if you go to Utah, it's the opposite. And then if you look around, just sort of like you have a state like Pennsylvania, oh, that's nice two-party, lots of lively two-party composition at the state level. But as soon as you go to the next level down, you have like Philadelphia, a Democratic stronghold, Pittsburgh, a Democratic stronghold, and people say Alabama in the middle, huge Republican strongholds, and that's Pennsylvania. So at the local level, you end up with even less democracy, inter-party democracy. So you can't run the country expecting two-party competition to be pretty lively everywhere at the local level or at the state level very easily. Instead, we end up with these one-party bastions or monopolies, local monopolies. Okay, so you have these local monopolies. Can you still have a democracy? Yes, because you have primary, so you open up the primary election, you introduce or you have primary elections, and then you can have the people voting in the primary elections, and then that could work, because then only the Republicans are voting there in the Republican elections in Utah and picking really good people, and only Democrats are voting in the the only thing that matters in Utah is the Republican primary, but they have them, and at least there's Democrats, or there's democracy among the Republicans there, democracy among the Democrats in Massachusetts. And then, of course, you'd probably have even people strategically choosing to change their party identification so they can vote in the primary that matters. But then you're back to nonpartisan elections anyway, because the primary ballot is what? It's just a list of names. It's like, oh, here's an office, sheriff. There are 3 people running to get the Republican nomination for sheriff, and they are Joe, Sally, and Pete. That's what you had with the nonpartisan elections that were so hard in the first place. So all you've done is shove into the primary the difficulty of you still have the same problem. There's no problem fixed here, really. It's a hard thing for voters to do. Now, one thing that we could imagine happening is this, bottom line. Why don't we have like lots and lots of little multi-party systems or two-party systems locally in the US? And I don't know. This is a good puzzle. This is a good puzzle for people who, it's more than just a puzzle, because it should happen. And in particular, back before we had primary elections, it really, really should have happened. And it did happen a bit from time to time here and there. But it wasn't broad enough to stop actually, essentially, I think, primary elections from becoming essential to have a local democracy. So I think primary elections came about essentially to kind of solve this problem. At the local and state level in 1890, there was almost no democracy. You had like 10 people in a smoke-filled room choosing the next governor in virtually all the states. Like, okay, does that sound democratic? No, not really. Because you were in New Hampshire, it was going to be a Republican. The only question was, who were the 10 people who got in that Republican, smoke-filled room or convention? Yeah, they rigged the convention and so on. In any case, at most a few hundred and possibly a few dozen people were choosing the main public officials all throughout the country, with a few exceptions here and there. So primary elections are introduced to fix that problem. But those are hard elections just like nonpartisan elections. What they do at the local level, instead of having primary elections and partisan elections and stuff, is they start shifting to nonpartisan elections. That is, who's they? The progressive movement. So these progressive people who don't like parties in the first place and then are also worried about this monopoly problem. Okay, so we have this difficult election, and there's not really much we can do about it. So is it not working? Is it like not working? Is it broken? I'm not going to have much to say about its brokenness, not brokenness, unfortunately, but that's like my research agenda going for the next, I don't know, years. Hopefully. There are scraps of evidence here and there, but the big hurdle really is how do you measure performance of a government? And we don't have good measures. Without those good measures, we don't even make progress on correlations, let alone anything causal. But there are scraps of evidence out there that suggest things aren't so terrible, including the data that I'm going to show you that I've collected. But here's some data other people collected. This is Gallup survey data. And one thing that's different about local governments compared to state governments and national governments, and state governments better than national, is that while trust or confidence in the government, has been falling and falling and falling here for the federal government, from 70% confident down to 40% confident or trust. At the local level, things have pretty much stayed flat until kind of a little bit of a COVID hit. But basically 70%, when they ask, how do you like your local government? It's like, oh, fine. you have a lot of trust, or at least some trust, fair amount of trust and confidence in your local government? They say yes. Do you like government generally? No. Do you like the federal government? No. Do you like your state government? Well, kind of 50-50 or 60-40. Yeah, 60, 55. Local government? Well, yeah, 70% say yes. And it's not partisan. Like, here's like the difference between Democrats and Republicans. So at the federal level, so if we take 2023, you take a year like 2023, that's what? That's, okay, Biden's president, Democrats control. Okay, Democrats like the federal government a lot. They have a lot of confidence and trust. Republicans hate the federal government. This flips, of course, when Trump takes over after 24 election, but it doesn't jump up to like 90% or anything. It just jumps up a bunch, and then this falls dramatically, and you end up with, 40, averaging to 40% or something here. It's just sort of that more or less these things flip. But basically, there's huge partisan differences in who likes the federal government. There's huge, pretty big partisan differences, although much smaller in how they like their state government, in part just because of sorting. Most Democrats live in a state that has a Democratic government, and vice versa. And so they like their government. So that's part of what's going on. However, it's also that overall they like the level. And then when they look at the local government, there's even less differences between Democrats and Republicans. And what's interesting is that's sort of been flat for the last 25 years. Basically, Democrats and Republicans roughly equally like their local governments. It used to be that Republicans like them a little more than Democrats, and Democrats have now crossed, and now Democrats like them a little more than Republicans. But both parties like their local governments, unlike the federal government, where the party out of power just hates that thing. Hates the thing that their party doesn't control, or in large numbers. Okay, so this is all stuff that's been known before, stuff that other people have done. So what have I done here? I would say we. There's a collection, a large-scale data collection effort with these people plus others, but these are the ones that I've been working with. Many former students, now professors, and then some current students. So we've been putting together two big data collections. One is on what's called cast vote records, which I'll talk about next, and then the other is data that you can get over time. So the cast vote record data is great for what we want to do, but it's only available for the last 4 years. 2020, 2022, 2024, for some subset of places. The other data that we've been collecting is precinct level data, which is not great because it's still aggregated. We can't tell, we have to make some strong assumptions to believe that you can get anything like a glimpse at what individuals are doing. And we kind of do want to know what individuals are doing. From some points of view, we don't, but from other points of view, we do, depending on your question. One of the questions we want to know when we ask the question, for example, how nationalized, how partisan, how polarized are local elections, I think we need to dig to the individual level. Because we're asking the question, you're a Democrat, here's a nonpartisan race, how did you vote? Here's a Republican, how did they vote? Did you guys always vote differently? Or they're really essentially, even for sheriff, even when there's no party level on the ballot, there's really always a D running and an R running, and the Ds all vote for D and the Rs all vote for R, or something else is going on. So that's where the cast vote record data come in. The other data are precinct level data. The good thing about them is you can get them for longer periods of time. You can go back a bit in time, and we're going back till about 2000, or if possible into the 1990s or even earlier. And we've got that for, say, a dozen states now. What we've learned from this data can be summarized in here. Nationalization and polarization have increased at the state level a lot, or a noticeable amount. Is it worrying? Don't know, but a lot. And you can clearly see it in the data. there's hardly any change happening at the local level over this, really over like a 25-year period. Hardly any change at all. So things haven't moved. Maybe things were already terrible, but I'll show you that maybe they aren't so terrible, at least in terms of partisan polarization. That's not, yeah. And it hasn't changed. When party labels are on the ballot, voting is highly partisan. So even if there's a party label, voters use it. 90% of the time, at least 80-some% of the time. Maybe not surprising, but there it is. And that happens all the way down the ticket. And so we conclude from that if we were running our local governments with partisan elections where there was always a D or an R next to every name, then we would have mostly local monopolies where in Massachusetts there wouldn't even be an R running, or just party line voting, and then the D's always winning in Massachusetts and the R's all winning in Utah and Texas and so on. One of the most important findings, I think, maybe the most important finding, if I can get this to work, is this last part. So when we look at these local spending measures, like on police and fire and roads, schools and so on, the voting is not very partisan at all. It's slightly partisan, slightly like you would expect. Democrats like government spending more than Republicans. But even in 2020, and from the data that I've been looking at just recently, 2024, roughly half the people who went in and voted for Trump, both times, at that same time voted to increase their local taxes or future local taxes with bonds to spend on local public goods and local services. So it's not the case that we're in a world where Republicans hate all government at all levels, even though that's kind of what you would infer, I think, from looking at the elites, from looking at the rhetoric, and from looking at the survey data when they're probing national issues. You would find over and over and over again Republicans saying, yes, just cut taxes, just cut spending, just cut taxes, just cut spending. And I think it's because they're always thinking of the national level. But when they come down to, when it comes to voting at the local level for the stuff they're going to have to consume, they're not all that ideological. And lots of Democrats are not all that ideological either. A lot of them are very pragmatic, I think. Let's try and find some evidence for pragmatism here towards the end. But in any case, 70% of them say yes, but 30% of them say no. 30% say no. Why? Oh, probably because they can't afford it. Or, well, we're already spending a lot on the schools. Why don't we spend even more on the schools? And so on and so forth. So, roughly speaking, 70-some% of Democrats saying yes to local spending, 48, 50% rounding, Republicans saying yes to spending. Like the gap of 20 points is what you see. So we're out of time, and I've got 50 slides to go. No, not really, but 10. But let me just, I've basically already said what the important thing is, but let me just show why we can do this, because I think this is sort of interesting for a non-American audience. So this is the ballot in Weld County from 2020. So here's a county in Colorado. This county here, Weld County. 350,000 people, et cetera, Trump-leaning county. We have the data. What we have is we have every single voter. We know exactly how they voted. And they voted on 5 pages of stuff. This is what the ballot was. It was 5 pages. So you had to vote on, you had to vote for president here, on the left. You had to vote for U.S. senator, you had to vote for House representative, state senator, state representative down here not shown, regional transportation director, nobody running, county commissioner, county commissioner, another county commissioner, county council, nonpartisan. You start the nonpartisan part of the ballot. You keep on going and you get to these ballot measures where you have to vote on stuff, I'll just skip that, these things at the state level. And every voter gets to vote on every one of these. And in principle would, has to. They don't have to, they can skip them. But they seem to feel obliged because 90+% vote on these. They can read them. Some people have done some research before going to the polls, but they can at least read them. And they can say, well, do I want to ban abortion after 22 weeks or not? Maybe they've done a little bit of research on what that would mean. Probably not, most people, but they've got some opinion and they go with that. And then at the local level, even more, here's starting the local part of the ballot. They get this part where they're voting on these local things like, extend the Fort Lupton sales tax, tax on marijuana. Another Fort Lupton one here was for the fire district. So everybody in Fort Lupton, small town in Colorado, voted on those things. Not everyone. Everyone who was at the polls in 2020 could vote on those things. And I don't know what the numbers are, but more than 95%, more than 90% probably did, and there was some roll-off. So what we can do is we can use all these things. We know who voted for Trump, and we know exactly at that same moment who voted for Trump, and then also who voted for all these other things, and who voted for Biden, and who voted for all these other things, and who voted like a straight Democratic ticket at the top, and then voted for lots of things down below. And we can use that to assess how partisan are these local elections, and that's basically what we find is some version of when you look at the very partisan, this absolute partisan gap would be, what's the difference between the Democrats voting for the liberal thing and the Republicans voting for the liberal thing? When it comes to a partisan office, it's 90%. So 95 to 5, that difference being 90%. If you look at a local partisan office, it's nearly as partisan. It's not quite 95 to 5, it's 97 to 7. Or 93 to 7, so the difference is 85. And then when you go to these local things or nonpartisan things, this number suddenly goes down a lot. And basically Democrats and Republicans are voting more like one another. The last thing that we can do just to wrap up here, so we can see they're not voting the same. But this would happen if they were also just flipping coins. So we'd like to know that they're not just flipping coins. And we have one scrap of evidence about that, which I won't even get to, but I'll tell you. On some of these ballots, you got to vote on multiple things on the same topic. Do you want to pass a bond for your schools to build new buildings, and do you want to pass a bond to buy new computers and other technology for the schools? And it turns out that people who want to spend on the schools want to spend on the schools in multiple ways. So at a minimum, there's a pro-school preference and a not pro-school preference at that moment held by large numbers of people. Not this gap of, say, 90%, but a gap of 60%. 60 percentage points, roughly. You could divide people into pro-spending types. Clearly pro-spend, you could say that 60% of the people, at least, have a very clear preference, probably even closer to 70, have a quite clear spending preference at that moment. So that suggests people aren't just flipping coins. And then we can go further and ask whether people are voting for good or bad candidates with extra information, and we find that, sure enough, they're voting a little more for the better candidates than for the worse candidates when we can come up with measures for that, and so on and so forth. So the bottom line is that after all this work, is that, we'll skip past all these, is that voters aren't very good, for sure, on average. However, maybe something like 20, 25% know something. And if all the rest are just flipping coins, that 20 or 25% determines the outcome almost all the time. So you don't need everybody to be well informed all the time to run a democracy. And I think what the don't have any evidence for this conjecture, but the conjecture I have is that lots of people hold little pieces of information about their local situation from their day-to-day lives, so they don't have to study much. Like, I'm a real estate developer, or I'm a realtor, or I'm a lawyer in the community, or I'm a school teacher in the community. I had my house, got caught on fire and the fire department came right away or didn't come right away. Or I've got kids in the schools. Or everybody, not everybody, but huge chunks of the society have little pieces of information about some part of local government, and that leads them to vote slightly more often in the right way than the wrong way. And as a result, maybe, this was the most optimistic view you can get, I think, they end up with a local government that performs pretty well, and that's why they're 70% happy.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so now we have plenty of time for questions. There are some microphones. Juan, just 1 second. Juan Vargas. There.
Thank you so much, Jim, for this inspiring presentation. So I wanted to ask you, I guess, 2 related questions. This is very right. I understand that we don't have hard evidence of any of these things, but it's very provocative, some of the things that you said, and I wanted first to ask whether you think that the fact that this sort of national level polarization hasn't gotten to the local politics just yet, at least not in great intensity. What is the main reason? Do you think that the main reason is that that people use sources of information other than sort of Fox News and sort of the polarized media? Is it because of the sort of media they have access to and they use, or what is your conjecture about this, about what explains this fact? And then the converse question is, what would be sort of the steps the U.S. would need to follow in order to bring this sort of non-partisan way of voting in a way that is more informed and better for society up to the state level and to the national level eventually? So what would be the path forward?
Is there any way we can put this last slide back?
Let's take the microphone.
So the last bullet point here, or the last thing, is like exactly what you asked, right? Like, so how are people collecting information? Where's this information coming from? Is it media? So for sure, it's not Fox News telling you anything about your local government. It might be giving you some clues that you shouldn't like government at all any of the time. You just can't trust politicians and stuff. So without any other information, you might just say, well, I can't trust politicians. They said in Washington, oh, but Albany, geez, I live in New York City, and Albany is so far away, I can't trust them probably either. And New York City is so huge, I really have no idea what's going on here in the government, so apparently I can't trust them either. So I just don't use, If that was all that was going on, then we would probably would have seen tons of nationalization. So that can't be exactly what's going on. In a small place, like where I used to live, Belmont, Massachusetts, from personal experience and my sample of 1 plus, I don't know, a dozen people I knew, there was tons of word of mouth stuff going on. Tons of word of mouth. And you just drove around the town and saw what the roads were like. you heard about, you pick up the local newspaper and you did read about like a fire, and the fire department actually put it out right away. You know, the police are asking for more money for the police, but it's not clear because they got a budget increase 2 years ago, blah, blah. You would get scraps of information here and there. And, you know, this is in a small, highly educated, you know, upper middle class community where probably lots of people paying attention. So this you could see how this could work even without a local media, because people were engaged and like were like on a day-to-day basis, not a day-to-day, but you know, several times a year, kind of like checking in on stuff. So I think that in small communities, say 50,000 people and less, that's probably a lot of what's going on. Again, just conjecture, but I don't even think it's the local media is doing all that much work. I think it's lots and lots of stuff we're just gonna have trouble finding out. Now, I don't think that, and then, so I think it's word of mouth plus your just own experience. Your own experience, you know, living there. You learn a bunch of stuff. And then in these towns, you pay the taxes too. You know, you like write the check every 4 months or every 3 months. So you know exactly how much you're paying in taxes, and you know what you're getting roughly. You know whether you feel safe, you're happy or not with the services you appear to think you're getting, or you know you're there, or you don't, but you have a sense. So I think now the thing is that I think that can't go up very far, right? Even the state level, it's probably already gone. What's our state level? What's Massachusetts government doing for us? I have no idea. Like, you know, so that's already too abstract and too far away. So I think as soon as I'm at the state level, I have to have the media doing it, and then the national. So I don't know how I can get any personal experience in there and word of mouth stuff to help me out. So I think there's a sense in which I'm much more optimistic going forward about local government than other governments. Now, just because of the way like the media landscape is working and stuff like that, and the importance of stuff like the media, especially for higher levels. But at the local level, it's not so essential if the place is small enough. For a place like New York City or even Boston, 650,000 people say, probably too big for even word of mouth to do very much. But even there, you know, you just get a sense, wow, like lots of people know Michelle Wu or know who she is and have a sense of what they're doing. And the local newspaper there does cover the local government a lot. Again, so it would be the media. So if you move to a city level like Boston, say, you know, 500,000 people roughly, say from 50,000, I think this could all work via what I was just saying before. The level of higher, 100,000, well, that's Cambridge. I think it's not working great that way, but not terrible. I know of word of mouth of stuff was going on, and lots of local campaigning and so on happening there. 500,000, I don't know, I can't imagine the word of mouth parts mattering all that much anymore. But maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe it actually does. Because the people aren't voting for the city. They think about the community. The cities are broken up into different communities, and they think that way. But for the national government, I really don't know what to propose.
Okay.
But just to finish, for sure, that's like what the next thing I would like to know. It's like, how are people getting information? And what information? And what are they using?
So the quality of political candidates is clearly endogenous, who decides to run for office. And so if the question I have is if you have any idea whether a partisan or a non-partisan system encourages more competent politicians to come forward. You can think of a story of option value. Did you put in more effort at the local level, then you get promoted to state level, which is partisan, and then to the federal level or something. So question is, what's your thought on that?
Yeah, so we have scraps of evidence out there. One scrap is from this paper that I wrote with Clara Lim. Another scrap is from this paper that Elliot Ash wrote with Cleod. for judges only, we have evidence that appointed systems actually work maybe the best a little bit, based on the crude quality measures that we have, like bar association evaluations, or how often their opinions are cited by other judges and things like this. There's scraps of evidence that out there that at least correlationally, and in the case of Eliot's work, this one here, kind of difference, at least, you know, somewhat better identified difference in difference estimates, that the systems, the partisan systems perform the worst. And we don't know the degree to which that's, the channel is, you know, there's a good and bad candidates running quite more or less equally in all systems, and then the voters pick the good ones in the non-partisan systems and less in the partisan systems. But I would guess that that can't be all that's going on. I would guess that one of the forces going on here is that in the non-partisan systems, different people come forth for judges. I don't know if how that would work for, say, sheriffs or county commissioners. And then also they're the worst, that's the one thing that we show a little bit more, have a little bit better, I think pretty good evidence on in that paper, that when the voters have a choice between a good one and a not good one, the not good one loses 85% of the time. So when there's a clear difference, as judged by, say, the Bar Association, which is good, bad, who knows, although it's highly correlated with other measures, as people have shown, then the voters do some selecting, but probably already in the mix, the nonpartisan systems might be weeding out the, via I'm not sure what, selection mechanism, maybe the first round elections, or just choose, you know, people knowing that they're going to lose in this system because voters. So the idea is this: voters do pay attention more to quality, to these quality differences in the non-partisan systems compared to the partisan systems. So we have this. We don't have any switches, so we can't do difference and differences where we could do the one. But in any case, we have Texas where they're partisan, for example, and then we have, say, California where they're nonpartisan. And then we can ask whether, and we also have in Texas the primaries, which are nonpartisan. And we can ask, well, how important is your bar association evaluation for winning? And in the nonpartisan elections, it's hugely important. You get changes your vote by a share by 20 points. That's this sort of 20% that are paying attention or something, like whatever, 20 points, 15, 20, 25. And you win, as if you're the better candidate, like 85%, 90% of the time. In the partisan systems, it changes the vote by 2 percentage points, and then the party decides. So whoever, if you're in a Democratic area, the Democrat wins. If you're in a Republican area, the Republican wins, and in a very small number of cases, the vote changes, you know, who wins. But then, as you were saying, well, in a heavily Republican area, then maybe the really good candidates want to run if they're Republicans. But I think overall, it appears that the scrap of evidence that we have is that at least the nonpartisan systems don't perform worse, and at least for judges, possibly perform better. So some selection mechanism together with the entry mechanism is working.
Any more questions? One more there.
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank you because it was, or at least for me, I felt that this was a very inspiring lecture. Among other reasons, because it allows us, or it allowed me at least to sort of look at the polarization literature from a different angle. Because when we read it from Europe, where mostly or all our elections are partisan, I was not able to fully understand like why the sudden U.S. concern about polarization so I was understanding it now in a different way. And one question following this latest discussion is, there has been also some increasing concern about the phenomenon of sorting, also geographical sorting, but I'm not sure if I'm taking it correctly. One positive consequence that we could extract from that process of sorting is that if it leads to more sorted states, but those elections happening in these very sorted states are less partisan, could imply that the voting in those states becomes more sophisticated, and then there is some more like better performance, because these, if like the higher stakes are in primary elections or in less, partisan elections, then the candidates may end up being better or at least more selected. Is this a line of thought that could be made, or I'm just extracting a lot of conclusions, very far-fetched?
No, that's a possible conclusion, that at a minimum, lots of sorting matters less. So sorting is very bad if what you really want is like, tough two-party competition, hyper two-party competition everywhere. First, the sorting that's been happening is kind of very slow and even goes a little back and forth. There's probably a little bit of a trend up and up and up. It's not first order changing the scenery overall in terms of like producing just by itself tons of super red states or super red localities and blue localities. There were already lots and lots of red. Even back in 1900, there's always been lots and lots of sorted places, partisan-wise, in the US. So that hasn't been increasing dramatically, but it's always been there, and it's always been an issue. And then the question is, how do you deal with it? So the proposal here is, as you saw, and it could be that if you end up then therefore with everything being nonpartisan or primaries working pretty well, then you don't mind too much sorting, you don't mind that much yet an increase in further sorting. So you put it aside as like, oh yeah, that's going to be a terrible thing, it's going to destroy our democracy if sorting just keeps on going and going. And you could even say, and even in fact, it's not even too bad, because there's a different argument by blanking on the name on why we want even more sorting and even more, actually, he argued, redistricting to make really heavily red districts and really heavily blue districts and just leave them like that. And the argument was that makes voters happy, because voters then therefore have their type. If you want to maximize happiness of the voters, you want everybody to be in a perfectly homogeneous red or blue district. Then it wasn't talking about getting good efficiency outcomes or anything like that. It was more like, well, therefore you get good representation. Everybody likes what their representative is doing most of the time in that kind of a world, rather than in the world where everything's 50-50 and half the voters like what the person's doing and half don't, based on a coin flip.
Okay. So, Tiziana, one last question.
Thank you very much for your presentation, very inspiring. I had a curiosity when you were mentioning the kind of local issues on which people is called to vote from times to times, a lot of items. I must imagine it's not easy sometimes. You were talking, I think, primarily of quite technical issues regarding, I don't know, spending for schools or kind of maybe facilities, roads, and so forth. I was thinking, I don't know if you know of evidence studies about more kind of divisive issues, like, I don't know, opening project or sanctuary policies, like for migrants, refugees, and, people that might be welcome or not. This kind of issues, if there is voting also at this very, individual level, asking for, do you want to take X people? And so, yeah, I'm just a curiosity.
Yeah, we don't, so from time to time, here's like, from time to time there are issues that come up that are these Ideological, hot button issues like the one on abortion in Colorado. Gay marriage has been on the ballot a lot. It was just on the ballot again in California in 2024. In the past, there was lots of voting on prohibition when prohibition was a heavily heavily important, big topic. There's still lots and lots of votes on alcohol-related things now, like here. Now they're not very partisan at all, but in the past they were one of these things that at that time, in say like 1910, 1920, 1930, heavily partisan. Stuff on actually admitting or not admitting particular types of immigrant groups I've never seen, but there have been, there are two issues that appear recently on a lot of ballots. One is to make English the official language of the state, or have only English taught in schools, and force non-English speaking students to be in an immersion and not do any bilingual, public education. That's been on the ballots some. And another has been to make sure that non-citizens don't get any chance of voting, to make sure that no local governments are allowed to allow, because that does happen in some places. Some local governments can allow, in some states, non-citizens to vote in some elections and so on and so forth. So there's been stuff on non-citizens being able to vote or not, and a couple, very rarely, but occasionally, on non-citizens or non-citizens in particular, or non-undocumented people, not declared which target, not being denied certain public services, including possibly education. So those do appear on the ballot, both at the state level and from time to time at local levels.
Okay, so let's thank Jim once again for the great lecture. Thank you. E grazie. E grazie a tutte e a tutti per essere venuti questa sera.